Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome you all for this COVID Pulse Pediatric Acute Care Training Series 2 from PICU and Department of Pediatrics Initiative. And I welcome you all for this special session. And we have done a Series 1 and we are going to the Series 2. Before going to the intro, to lead us in prayer to give God the glory. Heavenly Father, Lord, we come to your presence, Lord. Lord, every wisdom and knowledge come from you, Lord, and you are the Alpha and Omega. So, Lord, when we are starting this pediatric acute care training, an initiative from our department and unit through the CMC Vellore Pulse, Lord, we commit every activities in your hand. Lord, you give us the wisdom and guide us throughout these sessions, and which can be useful to all the participants, thereby the children of this country can be benefited. We give all the glory to you. In Jesus' precious name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all, and I welcome Dr. J.V. Peter, our director, who in the midst of his busy schedule and just kindly consent to be here and to grace the occasion. And over to Dr. J.V. Peter to have some opening remarks, and then we will go.
Very good afternoon to you all. On behalf of the institution, the faculty, staff, and students, I would like to welcome each one of you to this Pediatric Acute Care Training Program organized by the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit and the Department of Pediatrics. I think COVID has taught us many lessons in the past. And although we hope and pray that the pediatric wave will not happen, we need to be nevertheless prepared. And so I believe that this initiative is timely. When we were discussing in the task force appointed by the Supreme Court as to what should be the phrase that we should use for pediatric preparedness, a very nice statement came. And that statement includes the word repurpose. And the repurposing comprises of three components: repurpose space, repurpose equipment, and repurpose manpower. All of us are not trained to manage very sick people. And for people who are not involved in intensive care, it can be quite intimidating. And so it is useful that people who are less familiar and who require a little more confidence undergo a training program in managing sicker patients. And so there comes the repurposing of manpower. A lot of the adult equipment can be used in children. And so every institution needs to look at how they can repurpose adult equipment, which can be tailored for use in children. And of course, we need to repurpose spaces. It's not easy to create large pediatric institutions and wards. This is across the country. And so I leave this thought with you. Once again, I want to thank the department for this initiative and the Department of Missions Department for organizing so many lectures over the last 1.5 years. And I'm sure this will be of great benefit to the participants. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom and encouragement. And thanks a lot for coming and gracing this occasion. And Dr. Thomas Ram is there. Okay, so he has been a very great support to us from the missions office as Associate Director of Missions and his office. And they were helping us in reaching out to many mission hospitals and the peripheral hospitals. I really thank the missions office and Dr. Thomas Ram. And so, as an intro, with welcoming all the participants as well as the faculty for today and the moderator. So this series, we are going to start today, that is 16th August to 15th September. It's going on for about 4 weeks and 3 to 4 sessions per week. This is from the feedback which we got from the series 1. That time we had about 9 sessions of 16. That means every day there was 2 to 2.5 hours lecture. So we are spaced out with each 1 lecture per day, per session, except for the first 2 days. And I really want to thank our Department of Pediatrics, all the faculty from the infectious diseases, rheumatology and neonatology. They are going to join us tomorrow. and especially our own unit, Pediatric Intensive Care, Dr. Kala, who's the head of the unit, and Dolly, Sanket, Sivavyasam, Priyanka, Vandana, and all our team members who has put a lot of effort to carry out this. So this is our schedule for the next 3 to 4 weeks. Every week we are having 3 to 4 sessions. Today we have this introduction to COVID preparedness and COVID pediatric management by Dr. Winsley and Dr. Wilson, followed by the other sessions. Tomorrow, at the same time, we have the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children and the neonatal miss. So this is the session, and followed at the end by, we are going to put together everything by a simulation session, which that also we are planning to Zoom to our peripheral hospitals. For today's session, and I just hand over to our moderator. So I'm happy to welcome the moderator, that is Dr. Sibabrata Patnaik, is nothing but he's none other than our own fellow. So we thought in this pediatric acute care training series, we wanted to involve our alumni that's who have done pediatric intensive care fellowship and who worked with us for long. And today we have one of the senior fellows, and Dr. Sibabrata Patnaik. He's now the associate professor and head of pediatric intensive care at Kalinga Institute of Medical Sciences at Bhubaneswar, Odisha. And he has got his credit, and after his MD, he did his fellowship in pediatric intensive care from CMC Vellore and IDP CCM of the IAP and Intensive Care Society of Critical Care Medicine. And also did a fellowship in cardiac intensive care. And he's got more than 40 publications, and he's a national ALS instructor too. Without much delay, I just hand over to him to lead and introduce the speakers and the topic for today. Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you, sir. Sir, it's really a privilege for me to be involved in this great CME program conducted by my training institute, CMC Vellore. Really, whatever little bit recognition I'm getting now is because of my training in CMC Vellore, and I have been practicing this intensive care, whatever I've learned from there in our place, and we have been doing quite well, sir. And because of that, we have also been able to train a few more fellows also in our institute, sir. Sir, respected director, sir, Professor J.B. Peter, sir, respected Ebor, sir, respected Kala ma'am, all respected faculty and registrars of CMC Vellore. Department of Pediatrics. So without making much delay, I'm just going to the topic. That today's topic of discussion will be introduction to COVID preparedness, facilities, admissions, home isolations. It will be presented by Professor Winsley Rose, who is a professor in pediatric infectious disease department of pediatrics, and he has done his MBBS and MD from CMC Vellore and did his fellowship in pediatric infectious disease from Sick Kids Toronto, and also MSc in epidemiology from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He has interest of research in rickettsial infections and vaccine trials. He has more than 60 publications in national and international journals. And while I was doing my fellowship program at that time, he just returned from Toronto, and I had also a few interactions, interesting interactions with him. Over to Sir Winsley Rose.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. So this is going to be the first of a series of lectures which Dr. Ebor and his team has put together, basically to prepare ourselves for a possible third wave, and also to prepare ourselves in a way that we cannot, I mean, even those who are not necessarily pediatricians should be able to treat children if they were to become sick because of COVID. So this session, mine is probably the shortest session of the lot. And I'm just going to give you some perspective to tell you whether, whether third wave will be a reality or not, we don't know. And if the third wave were a reality, then what is its risk in children? And if there is some risk in children, then what is the way forward? How do we prepare ourselves towards it? So that's going to be the crux of my talk. So first, I'll try and answer the first question, which is, will there be a third wave? And if there is a third wave, would that actually affect children? So if you look at children getting infected due to COVID, this is a graph which actually shows you a bar diagram which actually shows you the number of people infected in a 5-year age band. If you look at it, I mean, it's obvious that the highest numbers are after 20 years of age and probably before 60 years of age. At both extremes of ages, that is both in less than 20 as well as more than 60, the numbers are somewhat smaller compared to this 20 to 60 year age group. Now, if you overlay that with the population distribution, if you look at the population distribution, the about 20% of the population is actually less than 20 years of age. Now, what is shown in the light blue is actually the population distribution. So if you look at it, even though a larger proportion of the population is actually in the less than 20 age group, there is still considerably lesser number of children getting affected because of COVID. Also, if you can see above 60-year age group also, even though the number of people are low, there is the number which is getting infected is actually much higher compared to the proportion of population in that particular age group. Now, compare that with the deaths. I showed you the graph which actually shows you the number of cases of adults and children. If you look at COVID-19 deaths by 5-year age group, this shows a very different story. The less than 20, there are hardly any deaths. I'm saying hardly any deaths, which doesn't mean there are no deaths. There are still some deaths, but it's very little. But the mortality obviously increases to a much greater extent as the age increases. And the mortality after 60 is actually much higher compared to the number of deaths in the age group above 60 is much higher compared to lower age groups, and less than 20 years, it's hardly anything. Now, I've just tried to overlay the deaths with the cases. So the one in light blue is the cases, and you can look at the case distribution, which is actually highest between 20 and 60, whereas the death rate being increasing with age, and it's highest actually after 60 years of age. So the bottom line is young children do get infected. So if you look at the graph less than 20 years of age, there is still a considerable number which actually gets infected. But if you look at the number of children dying in that same population, that is very, very little. This is a graph from the United States, which actually tells you the number of cases over the months and the number of the proportion of children that get infected. Now, when we started the pandemic, the number of, if you look at the child cases, it contributed to a much smaller proportion, that is only 2.6%, compared to when we are closer now. Like, as time has gone on, the proportion of children who got infected, who are getting infected, is actually higher. Now, there are three peaks that you see. Now, the first peak is probably the first wave, the second is the second wave, and there is a small bump, which is probably the third wave, or maybe just the end of the second wave. Now, corresponding to the increase in number of patients during the second wave, you can also see there is a correspondingly increasing number of children during those waves. So what is clear is children form a small proportion of those getting infected. If the total number goes up, the number of children will also go up. But as the wave, as the time progresses, the proportion of children as among all those who get infected, the proportion of children is actually slightly higher as we go along. There may be some reasons for it. One, I can easily think of is lack of vaccination. Children are not vaccinated, so whereas adults are vaccinated, adults had more disease, so they are probably to a certain extent immune, whereas children right now are not particularly very immune. So it is possible that the number of children getting infected as a proportion of the total number may be higher than what it was a few months ago. Now, this is our own data. I'm just going to show you some slides about our own, the number of children that we have seen. This information is from last year, almost the beginning of the pandemic till end of May. So I've shown in this white graph, which actually shows you the first wave and the second wave. And you can see that the second wave is sort of is come down significantly by May 31st. And this graph actually also shows you that the number of children, like proportionally like as it was in the first wave, the number of children were high, but in the second wave, the number of children are much higher for those 2 months, April and May. This just reflects that the total number of people who got infected was much higher. So in our first wave, that is between June of last year and till February of this year, March of this year, we had about 585 children. And in the wave 2, that is between March and May, it was 403 children. Now, if you actually look at whether there were any differences between these two groups, age distribution wise, there was no difference. Sex distribution, there was no difference. Males were more often infected compared to females. If you look at the age group as well, 15% less than 1 year, about 20 to 25% between 1 and 5 years, again about 25% between 6 to 10 years. But the larger proportion is between 11 to 16 years, which is close to about 35 to 40%. If you look at comorbidities, CMC being a referral center, a lot of the patients that come here actually have comorbidities. So 53% in the first wave had comorbidities and 45% had comorbidities in the second wave. This difference was significant, but if you look at it, it is still a very, very large percentage actually that had any comorbidities. Now, this may not be the same case if you were to live and work in a place where you live you work in the community, you work in a secondary care hospital. Your proportion of those with comorbidities may not be that high. We also looked at ICU admission, duration of stay in the ICUs, the mean duration of stay in hospital. So all of these, there was really no difference between the first and the second waves. Mean hospitalization, again, these are all not very useful because the hospitalization duration depended on what the government norms were. It's like, at some points in time, the government said, okay, you have to keep them irrespective of how sick they are. You have to keep them in hospital for a duration of 14 days and those kind of things. So this duration of hospital stay is not a good indicator of whether they are sick or not. But the duration of ICU stay is an indicator. So between wave 1 and 2, there was no difference. Again, severity of disease, 90% of all our children, even though a lot of them had comorbidities, were actually asymptomatic. There was no real difference between the first and the second wave. And one thing which I want to bring to your notice, we had a few more children with MIS-C compared to the second wave, in the first wave compared to the second wave. This is because MIS-C, this data which I'm showing you are all those who are COVID like RT-PCR positive. So those of you who are pediatricians, you can recognize that MIS-C is a disease which usually happens about 2 to 3 weeks after the illness, after the acute infection or an asymptomatic infection. Now, during that time, often the RT-PCR is negative, whereas it's only the COVID antibody which will be positive. So that it just shows that our second wave, if we had waited for maybe another 2 or 3 or 1 month, we may have captured many more children coming in with MIS-C as well, because the wave of MIS-C lags behind the wave of COVID by about 2 or 3 weeks. Deaths, we've had about 2 deaths during the first wave and 8 deaths during the second wave. I'll show you a little more details about the deaths, because you shouldn't go back thinking it's caused, I mean, a lot of children have died because of COVID. So this is the deaths which have happened, out of which 4 of them, the ones in red, are all less than 1 year of age. But out of this, all of them, apart from the one child who was 37 days old, everybody had some severe comorbid condition. It could be hematological, like T-cell ALL. It could be primary immunodeficiency. There was one with Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome and chronic granulomatous disease. There were children post-BMT, post-aplastic, I mean, children with aplastic anemia, B-cell ALL. So this one particular child who was 37 days old came with diarrhea and dehydration, subsequently went on to develop secondary sepsis and HLH and succumbed to the illness. Now, we don't know whether this HLH was primary or whether it was secondary to the COVID illness itself. Apart from that, every other child has had a significant comorbid condition which contributed to their death. Now, this is not from our study, just to show you that there are some very important differences when it comes to MISC. Male-female ratio is about the same. I showed in our COVID also, it's about 60-40, 60 males and 40 females. But what is important is the age group. The age group, the biggest age group causing having MISC is actually the 5 to 9 age group compared to the other ages. But whatever it is actually more above 5 years of age. Now, this is a graph which actually shows you in blue MISC, and the dotted line is actually what happens with acute COVID. So COVID-19, you can see the first wave is followed by MISC, second wave is followed by MISC, and the third wave again is followed by MISC. So each of these waves, the MISC lags the COVID wave by about 2 or 3 weeks. That's just to, just to reiterate that even in our own situation, even though our number of MISCs who were RT-PCR positive was very little in the second wave, if we had waited for our data, extended our data by a month, we would have got more patients in that group. Also, similarly, I told you we took only RT-PCR positives and not the RT-PCR negative COVID antibody positives. So what about children and COVID-19? I think children have less disease, less severe disease, and also there is lower mortality. Now, of the pediatric age group, infants are likely to become sicker, and one needs to be concerned about MISC in older children, which is a rare but a serious condition. Now, there was no major difference between waves 1 and 2. Now, just to reiterate, children, even though, mortality is lower, there is some mortality in children. Now, can there be a third wave? If you've looked at waves in other countries, there have been third waves, and whether they will be as severe as this particular second wave, we do not know, because there are a lot of unknown factors at play. Because even though our seropositivity rates in India, right now it's anywhere between 60 and 80%, even with such high seropositivity rates, we still see patients becoming sick with COVID. And it is possible that the variants are what are driving these things. Also, our poor vaccination coverage also is a reason for why the COVID waves are sort of going on and on. So it's very difficult to predict how severe the third wave would be. But I think one thing we should keep in mind, that whatever the severity is, we should not be caught unawares. We should be prepared. So like Dr. JVP mentioned in the beginning, he mentioned about the 3 things that you need to take care of. One was, repurposing manpower, repurposing equipment, and repurposing space. So I think if we think about these 3 things and work towards preparing for a potential third wave, I think we'll be okay. Now, what we are trying to do in this particular series of lectures is to repurpose personnel. That is basically try and provide information to people that may be expected to actually take on the care of children if there is a third wave which comes about. Now, one is be prepared. I mean, there is nothing wrong with being prepared. So make provision for staffing, equipment, oxygen, space, etc. And I think every institution or hospital should have a plan which can be executed once you have a certain number to reach a critical threshold. Like that number may be different for different places. I mean, I will just show you some examples of what we did. I mean, you cannot replicate what we've done because this is very CMC specific. But I think in your own hospitals, it may be useful for you to actually go through this exercise of having a critical threshold beyond which you will activate certain pathways which will take care of this the surge in COVID. So, I mean, these are some of the discussions we've had. I've just shown you what's there. So it's like, you know, this basically shows that if we have more than 10 cases of children with COVID for 3 days in a week, then we would activate the system. That is, we would figure out where the pediatric fevers will go. If they are stable, what we will do. If they are unstable, where they will go. How the admission pathway would be. If they are acutely ill, then where will they go? And if there is a increased number of beds, which if they require an increased number of beds, which wards will they put them in? So this is the kind of pathway that we have worked on for our own patients. I mean, you'll have to work it on for your own selves. Similarly, I mean, if like, you know, once that 10 per day for 3 days in 1 week, if it hits, then there was a pathway which we would get activated. Now, if that plan A we are not able to execute, what will our plan B be? Where all will we expand? I mean, which all wards will we convert into COVID wards? Which all beds in ICU will be made COVID beds? And if the ICU becomes full to capacity, then is there a place where we will shift patients out, where there will be facilities for oxygen, where we can put extra ventilators? So, I mean, so this is the kind of planning that we have done. And I would just encourage you also to actually plan for yourselves, like, you know, make surge capacity for COVID patients who are not sick, who are requiring oxygen, and who require ICU admission as well. Now, mind you, during this whole process, you should also keep a place where you keep suspect COVIDs, because till you prove that they have got COVID, you might want to keep them in a hold area where you should be able to provide all the adequate medical care, but that facility should be still be appropriate for treating COVID patients. So we also have a pathway for when we would test, like, you know, where the patient will come, and if they come, because we have a few points of entry. One is the triage, one is the child health outpatient, we have pediatric casualty. So we have a system of testing strategy, like, you know, for us, it's only somebody who comes with, you know, acute respiratory illness, or if they have features of SARI, or if they have features of MISC, then only we would test. In fact, if we do not require admission, we do not test. We will tell them that it is still possible to be COVID, but we teach them danger signs and then send them home and ask them to come back if there is a danger sign. And like, you know, this is just a strategy as to where they will go for isolation, who will examine them, you know, and like, you know, what the pathway would be before they go to the ward. And if they are asymptomatic, what we would do, like I said, if they're asymptomatic, we do not test, but we only advise home isolation. But if they have mild symptoms, then again, we don't test, but give home isolation. Only those requiring admission, then we test them. We've also put out what are the danger signs to look for, and for even children with mild illness, if they have risk factors, then they might require testing. So that's testing, because they might require hospitalization. So this is the kind of pathway that we use. I mean, I think we have, since this presentation itself will be available. You're welcome to use these slides, but they may be a bit CMC specific. We also home isolation protocol. We have a certain eligibility criteria for which patients are eligible for home isolation. That is, anybody who's less than 15 days or mild symptoms without comorbidities, then we would recommend home isolation. And they should also, we make sure that they are clinically examined and they are assigned for home isolation by a pediatrician. And we also figured out where this examination will happen. And there should be a caregiver available at home to provide 24/7 care. There should be some communication link for these patients. And they should also have a separate room with an attached toilet. Only then will home isolation be possible. And a parent or a guardian should sign a self-declaration for home isolation, which actually is in discussion with the medical officer. So, and we've also got some phone in. So everybody, there is a system of by which there are nurses who call up these patients every day, or the caregivers of these patients every day, and we teach them how to check heart rate, respiratory rate, saturation, and also look for any danger signs. And this is every day somebody calls them, and if there is any concerns with this, then they are asked to come in and get admitted. So, this is just an introduction. I'm not gone into specifics. Dr. Valsan will come up with more specifics about how to deal with children with COVID. So in conclusion, what I have to say is children have milder disease compared to adults. Deaths can happen, and it's often in children with underlying comorbidities. Third wave, it is possible that it can affect disproportionately the number of children, because compared to adults, children are not vaccinated. So you might have a susceptible pool there compared to adults. So it is possible that you'll have a disproportionate number of children getting infected. But whatever it is, we don't believe that the severity of illness will be different from the first and second waves, because there are some physiological explanations as to why children have less severe disease. And we don't think those are likely to change with COVID, with subsequent waves. So I think finally, the bottom line is it's better to be prepared. So this is the way to be prepared. So preparation is the key. So I'll stop here. I guess I'll hand over to Dr. Ebor and Dr. Patnaik. We can take questions later, I guess, after Dr. Valsan's talk.
Yeah, that will be good. After the Dr. Valsan's talk, we will take the questions. And if there is any questions, you can type in the chat box, please, and raise your hand also, maybe at the end of Dr. Valsan's talk. Over to Siba.
And also additional Deputy Chair of Hospital, HICC, CMC Vellore, and Faculty Clinical Epidemiology Unit, CMC Vellore. He has done MBBS, MD, DCS from CMC, a member editorial committee of NACO and of HIV/AIDS in children, electroviral dosing guidelines for national. Has contributed chapters to many books. Also a contributor for surveillance standard for vaccine preventable diseases, second edition, World Health Organization in 2018. He has a lot of interest in vaccine trials and vaccine preventable diseases, along with surveillance and biomarker studies. A lot of publications he has, and many chapters in different books also he has. And he will be discussing about acute COVID and its management to Sir Dr. Valsan.
Thank you, Dr. Sivabrata. Okay, so screen is visible, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah,
visible and you're audible. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I think thank you, Winsley, for that introduction. Thank you, Ebor and the PICU team for inviting us. I'm actually, as Winsley said, going to go into a little bit more of specifics on clinical manifestations and case management. So what we have, before that, I'll be talking a bit on the background and the updates with regard to, infections and what we are seeing. Winsley's actually presented to you data from, across the world and from the institution. I will narrowed down a little further out of the institution, but with regards to population data. Then we'll talk about how we suspect COVID-19, how do we classify disease severity into mild, moderate, and severe, and how do we manage. So SARS-CoV-2, this introductory slide, everyone knows, I don't need to talk about it, is basically one of the 3 beta coronaviruses that cause severe infections after SARS and MERS. So what actually has been in the news is actually the mutations, and the earliest mutation was the D614G spike protein. This is a receptor binding domain mutation. And after that, there have been many more. What receptor binding domain mutations and N-terminal domain mutations do, they actually increase the affinity of the virus to the ACE2 receptor. Therefore, you have more transmissibility. And then they also are associated with neutralizing antibody escape or immune escape. So the variants of concern, which all of us have heard about, are the alpha or the original Kent UK strain. This made up 90% of Punjab samples in February to March, and then was replaced from April onwards by Delta. Beta is the South African strain, Gamma is the Brazilian strain, and Delta, which we have all heard lots and lots about. This was originally identified from Maharashtra and has 2 new mutations. It is much more transmissible than the original strain. It's thought to be 6 times more transmissible, and it has immune escape. In March, it was made up 61% of Maharashtra samples and is now the predominant strain in India with 80 to 90% of samples from most states, and is now driving the surge of coronavirus worldwide, found in more than 99 countries, including, the news that we hear daily from the US. A lot of that is, because of the Delta strain. So this is a bit of data which is, showing what the waves were like. And as we said, Delta is more transmissible. So this is from data collected by the ICMR. And this actually, so the peak was basically around the middle of September. And then it came to a nadir at about the 1st of February. So they roughly said, okay, the second wave is starting from the 1st of February. And what is noticeable here is that at the peak, when across the country, daily cases were 100,000, a literal tsunami or a tidal wave of cases was seen in May. And this is by the middle of May, we were seeing 400,000 cases daily. And mortality or case fatality rate also went up a little bit. Now this is actually general data that was reported to the ICMR. 41 hospitals recruited patients during this period of time. This was set up on the 1st of September. So this is the first wave. So when they compared first wave versus second wave cases, what they found is that those under 20, there was a slight increase in the percentages or the percentages of the total number of cases. Under 20 still made up less than 5% of all the cases, but you had a more younger cases, so 26% of those 20 to 40 and 23% of those in the first wave. So there was a bit of a difference there. In addition, when you look at the mortality, interestingly enough, mortality in the under 20 in the second wave was actually less compared to the first wave, probably because of availability of equipment, availability of treatment modalities such as steroids and so at least in the younger age group, the mortality was actually not higher. Now this was not disaggregated by anything for under 20. So I'm actually going to show you just to compare between wave 1 and wave 2. that disease severity has been less in children in wave 1. This is data from the China CDC. In China, children make up 0 to 19 years makes up 17% of the population, but only 2% of cases were in children. And case fatality rate was 0.2% in that particular age group. Very similar to data from the US CDC, where children again make up 22% of the population, but only 1.7% of the cases. So disproportionately lower number of cases in children compared to the population proportions. And case fatality rate again sitting at 0.2. Both of these can be compared to mortality, which is over 18 to 25% in those over 80 years of age. And one small study from Tamil Nadu, which also showed a case fatality rate of 0.2% in children aged less than 14 years. Now, when you were to compare the first and the second waves, one of the things, now we in India have a higher proportion of children, whereas in Western countries and China, which has for a long had a one-child population rule for families, compared to that 17 to 22%, our population below 20 is 35%. And in spite of that, the proportion affected was approximately 9%. 2020 Maharashtra data for this age group was not there, but if you look at all the other age groups, between wave 1 and wave 2, proportions are very, very similar. So we think probably that the proportions of those did not change significantly between wave 1 and wave 2. Like we said, absolute numbers increased across the board in May. So this is velocity, this is all ages. Total cases from March previous year to February was 11,000, whereas March to May this year was the same number in a quarter of the time, 12,000. These deaths are adult deaths. Proportion of pediatric infections in November 2020 was 7% in Maharashtra and 8% in April 2021. So proportion again staying the same. Case fatality rate not increased in the second wave according to Maharashtra Health Department data. And Puducherry, closer to home, they documented 1% of their deaths were in the older children, 6 to 18 years of age. So the question is, why are children less affected? I know Dr. Winsley told you that there are reasons why children are less likely to be affected. And so for just to understand that, we'll just walk a bit through the pathogenesis. SARS-CoV-2 binds to the ACE2 receptor, and then a transmembrane serine protease on the cell cleaves the spike protein. This leads to fusion of the cell membrane, endocytosis, and release of RNA. This viral entry into the cell triggers an immune response with cytokine release. And in the lung, you end up with interstitial and alveolar edema, fibrinous exudate, formation of microthrombi, and impaired oxygenation. So why is it that children are less affected? One of the reasons children have is the pediatric lung has decreased epithelial expression of ACE2 and TMPRSS22 compared to the adult lung. And while in adults there are increased pro-inflammatory cytokines, children have more of increased immunomodulatory cytokines, which dampen the immune response. In addition, children have a better CD8 T cell activation, a better antibody response, and this concept of trained immunity has been spoken about a lot, which is basically saying that innate immune memory to frequent infections and vaccinations leads to a better killer cell response to new viral infections. So what is evident is that children do have a different clinical course. They tend to have the initial stage and then get better very fast. Very few of they do tend not to have the progressive or hyperinflammatory stage that is seen in adults and older adults. So and this is reflected in clinical symptoms. When we talk about symptomatology, whereas adults have, predominantly fever, cough, breathlessness, children tend to have only about half of children have fever and cough. And when you talk about other symptoms such as myalgia, headache, which are again commonly seen in adults, only a quarter of children tend to have these symptoms. Now, this is data from the US CDC in 2020, and this is borne out by later data, which is just published in August 2021, and with 1,734 PCR-approved children. And what it shows, this graph actually shows you on the blue bars, older children between 12 to 17 years of age, and the red bars are younger children, 5 to 11 years of age. While younger children tend to present with more fever compared to older children tend to have more of headache, fatigue, sore throat, and anosmia, which is very less commonly documented by younger children. In addition, a lot of other symptoms are there which can mimic any viral infection. So when do you suspect COVID-19 in children? You have fever, headache, myalgia, tiredness, coryza, cough, sore throat, rapid breathing. In addition, some children can have diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain, especially younger children, poor feeding in an infant, or loss of taste or smell in an older child. And then anything that suggests a multisystem inflammatory syndrome or a Kawasaki phenotype, which would include rash, conjunctival congestion, mucositis, or shock. And then, of course, if a child is a close household contact with a COVID-19 case, even if that child is asymptomatic, one would suspect that that child has COVID infection. So Winsley has already shown that the proportions of asymptomatics are quite large. This is hospital-based data. This is a little, biased because these were only the contacts of symptomatic adults who are tested. So I would not take this asymptomatic very significantly. But what is interesting here is when you look at the proportions of hospitalized, severe, and critical children versus adults, whereas adults had, altogether about 13 to 14% of, severe disease. In children, that was only 2.5%. And whereas critical disease was seen in 4.7% of adults, children have just about a tenth, 0.4%. So again, just reiterating the point that disease severity is less severe in children. So there are a lot of guidelines out there, and both from the Government of India and as well as the IAP. So we are going to talk about what is available. So clinical features, as we mentioned, majority of children are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. Common symptoms we've already spoken about. And when you talk about children with mild symptoms, they can have any of the standard fever, cough, rhinorrhea, sore throat, body ache, myalgia, weakness, can have diarrhea, can have anorexia, can have loss of taste or smell. And respiratory rate, the one thing that's common between these two is that they are not tachypneic. That is, the respiratory rates are normal for age. We will walk our way through that. And in addition, on room air, the oxygen saturation should be 94% or greater. So when it comes to moderate and severe illness, and this is from the latest Government of India guideline, which is available on the intranet, 18 June 2021. Moderate is defined as a child who has rapid respiration, and most pediatricians will know these cutoffs. Under 2 months of age, more than 60 or greater, 2 to 12 months, 50 respiratory rate or greater, 1 to 5 years, 40 or greater, and more than 5 years, respiratory rate of 30 or greater. Saturations should be above 90% for moderate, and there should be no danger signs. Again, the danger signs are classically lethargy, somnolence, excessive sleepiness, inability to feed, grunting, severe chest indrawing, or cyanosis or seizures. In severe disease, the same respiratory rates apply, but the danger signs will also be present. So this is our flowchart for testing, and I think you've seen that with Winsley. Acute febrile illness, which can be anything like a viral respiratory illness, with or without myalgia, headache, diarrhea, anosmia, or loss of taste. Anyone with with tachypnea in a pandemic situation, we would definitely consider that would be a suspected case. and anyone with a multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And we will talk a bit about this definition a little later. So these are our indications for testing. For those of you who are coming in, or attending this from CMC, I think our intranet page is so crowded, I thought I should show you where it is. So on the intranet page, COVID information and guidelines, you will end up with 2021 protocols. Please don't click on the 2020 protocols. And then you go to protocols for patients. And then you have both the standard operating procedure for home isolation and the pediatric protocols are L, and they are all updated as of 7th May 2021. So who do we test? Now, this is from the IAP protocol, which also came out in June 2021. What the IAP says is testing is ideally should be done for all suspect cases, and that is to prevent transmission to other household members or prior to any procedure. However, if resources are scarce, and you may not believe it, but even we get swamped with testing so much that so we are also not fully resource unlimited setting. So testing can be deferred for both asymptomatic contacts and children with mild symptoms and no comorbidities, plus a known positive family member. So in this situation, you don't need to test. You assume that this child is COVID infected and should be home isolated. So this is our protocol for testing. We don't test asymptomatic children or children with mild illness with no risk factors. We advise home isolation. We tell the parent what the danger signs are. And then we say come for admission if there is symptomatology. And anyway, with the home isolation protocol, if that can be followed up, then you can even pick it up and ask them to come in if there is any worsening. Now, anyone with tachypnea needs to be admitted. And the reason is, although we know that, only a small proportion go into severe or critical illness, tachypnea is like a red flag. And so we would rather have this child under observation, the same cutoffs that we spoke about, 60, 50, 40, and 30 for 0 to 2 months, 2 to 1 year, 1 to 5, and more than 5, with or without chest indrawing or danger signs, or any multisystem inflammatory syndrome we would admit, or any mild illness with the risk factors. And the risk factors would be underlying congenital or acquired heart disease, any other underlying pathology, kidney, lung, liver, neuromuscular especially, any immunosuppression or obesity, which is thought to be one of the risk factors for worse outcome in adolescents. And the danger signs most pediatricians will know, but I will just walk you through that: fast breathing, cyanosis, not drinking, vomiting, irritability, unconsolable cry, lethargy, or excessive sleepiness. So asymptomatic children, according to the government protocol, just require monitoring, and symptoms we have already spoken about. No investigations are needed at this point in time. These children should be managed at home with home isolation. Dr. Winsley has already spoken about this, about the home isolation protocol. We have 3 categories, A, B, and C. So category A is 1 to 15, who have normal heart rate, normal respiratory rate, normal saturation, and no danger signs. Those who are category B or less than 1 year, almost invariably, the decision as to whether this child can be managed at home rests with the examining pediatrician. And but there also, if the child is otherwise well, can be managed at home. But children of any age with underlying comorbidities, we would prefer to admit for observation. So this is from the WHO protocol manual, and this is also easily available on the net. And a lot of good basic things here. One is a separate room or an isolated space, maintain distance from others, keep the room well ventilated, keep the windows open. One household member should be the contact person, and this is important, that should not be a high-risk person. We've had a situation where we've had doctors falling ill, and there was a small child at home, and the only other person at home was the grandparent. So at that point, we were forced to tell the parents, well, you're going into isolation. and your child is going with you, because we cannot have your 70-year-old father looking after the child, and have the risk of falling sick. In the room, a surgical mask is recommended. This can be done for children above the age of 2. Separate dishes, utensils, and then monitoring, which needs to be done. So a few things, what do we do for monitoring? Monitor oxygen saturation. Separate room with bathroom is preferable, but this is not always possible. So if there's only one bathroom, all surfaces should be cleaned with Lysol after use by the infected person. And distance should continue to be maintained. The personal items should not be shared. Eating utensils should not be shared and washed separately. And at the end of isolation, the room should be sanitized. And I may remind you that this is actually a very lonely time, especially for children. Older children, you can sort of manage. Younger children, most often, one of the parents is also ill. So, that's the psychological support that children need during home isolation. So monitoring, we would advise them to monitor the respiratory rate, look for any evidence of danger signs, and then contact the doctor if there's any problem. Paracetamol can be used. There's no need for antibiotics. Warm saline gargles may be used for soothing the throat, and then make sure that oral fluids are maintained and that hydration is maintained. So now we'll talk about the management of moderate COVID-19. Moderate, as we already mentioned, is again based on the respiratory rate. Oxygen saturation should be above 90%. If the oxygen saturation falls below 90%, that is considered severe. Here again, no lab tests are routinely required. According to the government protocol, they should be admitted in a dedicated COVID health center or a secondary level healthcare facility and monitored. Fluid and electrolytes, basically maintaining fluids. Oral is okay, IV if there is vomiting, and paracetamol to be continued. If there is a strong suspicion of bacterial infection, antibiotics can be started. And if the saturation is, like we said, above 90 is moderate, but if it's below 90, between 90 and 94, oxygen supplementation is required. Now, we'll just move on to what is severe disease. And so severe disease is tachypnea with a saturation less than 90%, increased effort, severe retractions, any danger signs, and critical diseases, ARDS, shock, and multi-organ dysfunction. And so this is our protocol for treatment. We have said no empiric antibiotics for mild illness, no empiric antibiotics for mild illness, even with any risk factor. Only thing is we would, with risk factors, as I already mentioned, we would admit, we would send counts and a blood culture, and then we will monitor. The child who's got moderate illness, which is tachypnea with chest indrawing, danger signs, or multisystem inflammatory syndrome, is admitted. And this is one place where our protocol differs from most of the other protocols, in that we say we define moderate illness as oxygen saturation which is above 90% or normal in room air. And if you need to start oxygen, it should be over 94%, equal to or over 94%. The reason is because most of the protocols that you see will talk about a recommendation of steroids if a child is, worsening saturation. So we would, unfortunately, if we put this into the protocol, that is, you can start oxygen for moderate illness, one of the issues that comes is, I think we will end up tempting a lot of people to start steroids unnecessarily. So for us, if the saturation stays over 94% on oxygen, we say that's moderate illness and does not require anything other than supplemental oxygen. We normally send CBCs and blood culture. We do a chest X-ray and we start either oral or IV, amoxicillin or augmentin. We stop antibiotics after 5 to 7 days, especially normally during that time, children actually tend to improve and can be discharged home. So this is what is categorized as severe, which is an oxygen saturation less than 90%. For us, we define oxygen saturation as not just less than 90%, also less than 94% on oxygen 2 liters per minute. So if your oxygen saturation comes up to 94 and above, we will call it moderate and we will wait. But if they are unable to maintain saturation on 2 liters per minute, then we call it severe COVID-19. Baseline investigations are all sent at this point of time, other than the CBCs and the blood culture. So we increase the supplemental oxygen. Broad spectrum IV antibiotics are started. And this also is stopped after 5 days if there's no evidence of bacterial infection. And if you're not able to maintain saturation, this is the point at which dexamethasone is started. It's given as a single daily dose, 0.15 milligram per kg, maximum doses 6 mg. And then prophylactic dose anticoagulation is sometimes started in these children if the D dimer is extremely high. The reason for starting dexamethasone is basically from the recovery trial, which showed that deaths were reduced by 35% in those given dexamethasone, in those who needed mechanical ventilation, and by 20% in those on oxygen. So for critical disease, which is worsening oxygenation, ARDS, and shock, a lot of this is going to be dealt with in the coming few days. I'm just giving you the overview. So respiratory support is needed. Normally what is started is non-invasive ventilation before mechanical ventilation. Fluid resuscitation for shock using crystalloids. Vasoactive agents are given if shock persists after 2 fluid boluses. We repeat blood parameters every 48 hours. And this is the point, critical illness, that we start looking for multisystem inflammatory syndrome by sending troponin, cardiac enzymes. We do an ECG and an echocardiogram to make sure there is no evidence of Kawasaki-like illness. And then if there is any evidence of thromboembolism, or if on the echocardiogram, ejection fraction is low, less than 35%, or if there is a coronary aneurysm with a Z-score more than 10, then therapeutic dose anticoagulation is given. All anticoagulation, either prophylactic or therapeutic, is stopped the moment the child leaves the ICU. So a bit of background about the multisystem inflammatory syndrome. This is the very first case that was described of Kawasaki disease with COVID. And this was a 6-month-old with fever for 2 days, rash from day 2, polymorphic, had conjunctivitis, which you can see there, had a strawberry tongue, had edema and erythema of the hands and feet. This child was PCR positive, was treated with IVIG and aspirin, had a normal echo, made an uneventful recovery. And this was followed by a spate of cases documented from Italy and France in April and May last year. This Miss C accounted for 10% of all pediatric cases and 4% of the cases which were seen at CMC. What is the difference from pre-COVID Kawasaki? It's seen in older children, and Winsley actually mentioned that myocarditis and pericarditis is more common. Platelet count and lymphocyte counts are low. Classic Kawasaki actually has thrombocytosis, not thrombocytopenia. Can occur anywhere between 2 to 5 weeks after infection. So is often antibody positive in 75 to 80%, but can also be PCR positive depending on when it occurs. So it's thought to be due to antibody dependent enhancement, often in children who have been asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. And Dr. Satish will be talking into a lot more detail about Miss C tomorrow. This is just to show you, again, something which Dr. Winsley has emphasized. This is data from the US from March to January 2021. The black line is the number of pediatric cases in thousands. And so their first peak in March 2020, the peak of Miss C, which is the blue line, which is in actual numbers, not in thousands, this came in April. Then they had another peak in July, and followed by a peak of Miss C in August. And this data here is incomplete. So these are things to expect. When your cases start coming down, that is the time when you can have more of MIS-C. How is this different from classic COVID? While classic COVID, we said children, about half of children have respiratory symptoms. MIS-C seems to have predominantly gastrointestinal symptoms, and only about 1/3 have respiratory symptoms. Signs which are suggestive of a Kawasaki, such as conjunctivitis and rash, are the commonest, seen in about half of children. Cracked lips, oral erythema in about 40%. Edema and desquamation and adenopathy are the least common manifestations. Classic Kawasaki is only seen in about 20 to 40%, but half of them can have shock and about 20% can have acute renal failure. Most of these children have increased acute phase reactants with elevated CRP, procalcitonin, elevated AST, D-dimer, ferritin. And when you look at the cardiac enzymes, about 40% have myocardial dysfunction on an echo and elevated cardiac enzymes, and about 25% can have a pericardial effusion, 15% can have coronary artery changes. So I want to talk a bit about this definition because, this is one of the things which, although is being spoken about tomorrow, I want to emphasize that, we do tend to overdiagnose MIS-C, especially when if you're not careful about following. And to remember, this is just a preliminary case definition to make you suspect MIS-C. So the WHO definition is what we follow: fever for more than 3 days, 2 of the following, which is Kawasaki-like features, rash, conjunctivitis, etc. Shock, features of myocardial dysfunction, which can be either echo or cardiac enzyme elevation, evidence of coagulopathy, elevated PT-PTT, and acute GI symptoms. So 2 of any of these, plus elevated inflammatory markers, which is an ESR or an elevated CRP, and evidence of COVID-19, which can be either a PCR positivity, antibody positivity, or a likely family contact with COVID-19. The point to be emphasized is there should be you should actively look for other microbial cause of inflammation, such as bacterial sepsis, and during this season, dengue fever, scrub typhus, typhoid, which is often year-round, depending on where you are. Other systems that can be involved, this is from the other definitions. The RCPCH can be renal, respiratory, neurological, dermatologic, or hematologic manifestations. So just to emphasize the point I'm making, I'm just going to talk about a case whom I saw last week in OPD. 9-year-old child came with fever for 7 days, had abdominal pain and vomiting for 2 days, and pain in the right leg for 1 day. Had no rash, oral erythema, or conjunctivitis. No one in the family had COVID-19, but because of the abdominal pain and vomiting, was admitted with diagnosis of acute abdomen and query MIS-C. So what are the lab investigations? Blood counts and PT-PTT were normal. SGOT was mildly elevated. SGPT was normal. Electrolytes were normal. ESR was elevated. CRP was elevated, 70. Ferritin was elevated. D-dimer was elevated. Echocardiogram was done, which showed normal systolic function, no aneurysms. And they did SARS-CoV-2 PCR and antibody, which were both negative. And then they told the parents that, well, your child has probable MIS-C. We would like to give you IVIG. So just to walk you through this definition all over again, what we said is fever and 2 of the following. So that is Kawasaki-like illness, shock, myocardial dysfunction, coagulopathy, and GI symptoms. So when you look at this, what this child had, he had fever and only 1 of the following, which were your GI symptoms. He did not have coagulopathy. The point I'm trying to make is that the elevated inflammatory markers is after you make the diagnosis of fever plus 2 of the following. So he did have elevated inflammatory markers. And in addition, he did not have any evidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So here, evidence of COVID-19, PCR, antibody, or a likely contact. And here you have no contact, PCR and antibody negative. So child came here on day 11 after onset of illness, was afebrile by that time, examination was normal. We found the ESR was trending down, CRP was also coming down. ASO was normal. We did that because of the pain in the leg, whether, there was some evidence of rheumatic. Scrub typhus was negative. Echo and ECG we repeated because that's one of the things that you're supposed to do to rule out a coronary artery aneurysm. And the Vidal was suggestive of typhoid. And then when we looked at the history, there was a Vidal which was positive on day 7 of illness, and the enzymes were, the test was again trending down on day 11. So had already received azithromycin, meropenem, and ceftriaxone, all of which will act against Salmonella typhi. So the diagnosis in this child was typhoid and not multisystem inflammatory syndrome. So the point to make here is don't go by just the inflammatory markers and the D-dimer or the ferritin, because we tend to do all this, in these tests, which we never used to do before. And we actually have no idea what that is in other illnesses such as dengue, typhoid, or scrub typhus. So this is the latest guidelines that has come out for management of multisystem inflammatory syndrome. So it says MIS-C with shock, IVIG and methylprednisolone, with Kawasaki phenotype, IVIG and methylprednisolone, and MIS-C without shock, methylprednisolone alone. And so this is actually what we had put into our protocol in May. So for shock or multi-organ dysfunction, we had said IVIG plus methylprednisolone. And if the shock or multi-organ dysfunction was absent in MIS-C, what we said is you could give either IVIG or methylprednisolone. However, with the Kawasaki phenotype, what we would prefer is to give IVIG to prevent a coronary artery aneurysm. And in addition, if there is evidence of coronary artery aneurysm, therapeutic dose anticoagulation. If there is no evidence of coronary artery aneurysm and the left ventricular ejection fraction is more than 35%, low dose aspirin is recommended for 6 to 8 weeks. And then repeat echoes are supposed to be done at 1 to 2 weeks and 4 to 6 weeks afterwards. So just to show you the outcomes of, MIS-C. So what we can see is this is data from the US, from Chennai, from Mumbai, and from our own PICU. You will notice that most treatment has been IVIG and steroids. And in Mumbai and CMC, it's been predominantly steroids and less of IVIG compared to Chennai and the US. Immune modulators such as tocilizumab have been used very, very infrequently, even in India, and not been used in our PICU as well. Outcomes have been pretty good. So this is the outcome. Outcomes are good. IVIG on steroids given in most time from treatment to remission of fever is 2 to 5 days. Inflammatory and cardiac markers resolved by 2 weeks. Left ventricular function recovers in 90% within a month and in up to 100% within 3 months. Same for coronary artery aneurysms. So thank you very much. This protocol has been prepared, as a multidisciplinary output with people from infectious diseases, rheumatology, and intensive care. Thank you to all the people who put their efforts into the protocol, Dr. Winsley, Dr. Anila, Dr. Satish, Dr. Ebor, and thank you, all of you, for your hard work during COVID pandemic. Thank you.
So we can have some 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minute session for the question answers.
Yes, sir. So first question, actually, I had asked Dr. Winsley regarding why the tail is becoming so thick now. Why we are not seeing sudden, and in the first wave when the SARS came and it went also very quickly. Here we are finding that cases are still in not very less and it is prolonging. Is there any particular reason for this, sir? For Dr. Winsley?
So I don't think I can give you a good answer because, see, I think one reason why there may be a tail itself is because there is emerging variants, there is waning immunity. So all of that put together, that is the reason why the epidemic is not going off. So now, how this tail will behave, when the tail will take an upturn and become an epidemic wave, we don't know. I mean, that's every epidemiologist's dream to predict. But but I don't think we can predict it very easily. But the reason behind it, I think, is because of the variants emerging.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you. Another question, Dr. Nisha George has asked, why
Yeah.
is home care?
Home care is just that we see children only up till 15. Like, you know, that is why our cutoff is 15, because above 15, the adults take care of them. So home care is available for across all ages. I've just mentioned up to 15 because it's for children.
Is it something that children below 15 are less seriously affected? So home care is more required for children compared to adults?
In fact, it sort of worked the other way around. Initially, the government said all children have to be admitted. Yeah. But now, anyway, after with some experience, we know that that's not so much the case. So we are quite happy to actually keep the children on the home care.
Okay, sir. Another question. What is the opinion on starting school with these available data? How long do you wait? Anupunan has asked. Regarding opening of the school,
So,
sir.
No, Winsley, go
ahead. I know. The thing about schools is, see, first of all, I think there are two things to be answered. One, if children develop COVID, will they develop severe disease? And the second thing is, if children come into mixed schools, how much infection there will be, whether they will take it back to their homes, and whether they will transmit to other people. Now, if you have a population that is actually well vaccinated and you send the children to school, it's okay. But if the population is not vaccinated and then you send the children to school, then it is likely that the children will bring back disease and give it to their elderly grandparents or older parents. And, you know, so that is a risk. But for the children themselves, there may not be a big risk for developing severe disease.
So I think I want to add on a story. This is the laboratory for children and schools is currently the US, because in Florida, where the vaccination rate is less than 50% of adults, they decided to open schools. The governor, who's a staunch pro-Trump Republican, said no masks. You know, so there are people standing outside school boards fighting not to wear masks. So the problem basically is, you know, exactly what Winsley said. You have a state which is less than 50% vaccinated. Schools refuse to let children in without masks. Despite this, you know, they ended up with some areas, you know, with no social distancing. Children below 12, there have been outbreaks in most of the schools with children. Now the children have very mild illness, but in the last week, in one school, 3 teachers died of COVID-19. So this is the other, you know, fact that you children can carry the infection, can transmit it, and so not only take it back home, you can bring it from an unmasked, unvaccinated household to the school and give it to an unvaccinated teacher. So I think one of the things that we should be talking about before starting schools is make sure everyone is vaccinated. Most breakthrough infections with Delta, you know, have happened, you know, despite vaccination, but you know, hospitalization and severity is much less. Transmissibility with the Delta variant is much more. So you can still get an infection, but, you know, your risk of hospitalization is very, very low. So I think, you know, to answer fully that question, we need to vaccinate teachers, and, you know, we need to, in the schools, follow some degree of social distance.
Another question is that how long do the antibodies last in children with moderate to severe COVID? Valson's.
Yeah, antibodies actually don't last very long. In fact, there is evidence that antibodies with moderate to severe last longer than if you have mild infection. But, you know, your antibodies do wane. If you look at seroprevalence studies that were done last year, what you find in India, what you find is that after the initial first wave peak, seroprevalence actually fell and then rose again with the second wave. So your antibody levels are lower with natural infection, are higher with vaccination, and are highest if you have vaccination after a natural infection.
Yes, sir. Sir, Antonio Jude Raja Balraj has asked, sir, whether the pediatric population also had a negative COVID in the initial presentation and later turned on to be positive like the adults. It's difficult to understand the question. Pediatric population also had negative COVID in the initial presentation and later turned to be positive. I don't think everybody is positive means positive. Negative COVID cannot be turned to be positive COVID. Some confusion in the question.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure whether
Then another question.
Sorry. No, I'm not sure whether the
Look,
question is basically that you can still have a negative COVID. It depends on the test. It depends on how well the test is done. It depends on how good the sample is that you're taking. You can take just the anterior nas and get a negative COVID test if you haven't taken a proper nasopharyngeal sample. So there are just too many factors to say negative COVID. I think the other question is, if you have multisystem inflammatory syndrome, those are children who were asymptomatic and not tested, so they were PCR negative and then turned out to be antibody positive when they presented later with multisystem disease.
Okay, so another question, sir, by Dr. Edward Ruben. Very important question actually, to predict the MIS in advance. How can we predict? It's a really very important question. Which type of children, which sort of children, with what problem?
You are breaking, Siba. Your voice is breaking, Siba.
And we can know that this child can develop MIS so that we can be prepared. Yes, sir.
Did you come across any predictive factors for MIS?
No, I don't think we have any. I mean, people have looked at antibody levels and all that, but we don't have a good idea as to what these things are. So, Edward and Walson, I have to leave.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. I'll catch. If there are any questions, I'll answer later.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Winsley. So I think we have come to the end. Siba, I think we lost him. Walson,
Yes,
any other questions to be answered? So the answer to the question, any factors to predict MIS-C?
Yeah, no, I don't exactly what I think. We don't have any way of predicting MIS-C. We cannot say age is not a predictive factor, although MIS-C is commoner in older children. There are so many older children who don't have. So neither are there comorbidities able to predict MIS-C. And then when you do antibodies, even antibody levels cannot predict MIS-C, although it is supposed to be antibody dependent enhancement. So unfortunately, there is no way we can predict MIS-C as of now. We don't have any data on that. Yeah, I think there was a question here on false negativity rate of COVID PCR. Would it be better to have a holistic approach and guidelines to respiratory illnesses? So I am happy to answer that. So let me tell you, our general government guidelines are basically to say you do one PCR. Now, actually speaking, if you do 2 PCRs and your positivity rate goes up, that's number one. Number two is the time of doing the PCR. Your positivity rate for PCR is best if you do it between 3 and 7 days of illness. So assume you have a child at home, who's asymptomatic, father's been found to be positive. I would actually give a little time before I do a PCR for that child. That's the second option. The third thing is basically to directly answer that question. This holistic approach and guidelines to respiratory illness. I absolutely agree with you. In fact, if you look at these guidelines for mild, moderate, severe, that is taken from the guidelines that the WHO made during the H1N1 pandemic. Now, unfortunately, what has happened even in our own hospital is what you need is you need a separate facility, you need an isolated facility. For COVID-19, you are actually using personal protective equipment to the extent that you are gowning in when you go in, gowning out when you go out. So no other respiratory infection gives you that degree of stress on your healthcare setup compared to what COVID-19 does. So, and I know that in bronchiolitis, ordinary RSV bronchiolitis, influenza, you're supposed to respiratory isolate all your bronchiolitis children. Practically speaking, we have never managed to do that except during H1N1 and during COVID-19, because respiratory illnesses are just so many in number that, getting a separate isolation facility for respiratory illnesses is ideal, not always feasible. But, I think universal masking, vaccination, and, I think one of the, if we can manage some degree of social distancing in the community, which is easier said than done, and hand washing and personal, hand hygiene in the hospital, at least that is one of those are some of the things that we can do.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Any other questions?
Sir, I had one question actually. I will be sharing my experience in our hospital. Actually, our hospital was converted to a COVID hospital. So we had in this wave we had around 3,200 total adult cases, adult and pediatric cases. Out of that, less than 18-year children were only 54, and of the 54, two actually died. Others had good outcome. One child, actually, I am very interested to know and share that one child had Plasmodium falciparum positive. And he presented actually as a case of falciparum. We thought it's a cerebral malaria because from outside it came with a report of PFR positive.
Sure.
Here, when we did a routine screening of COVID, it came out to be positive. Then he was shifted to our COVID unit. However, on the day one, he was intubated because of the low GCS. But on the second day, gradually GCS improved. But when we did the biomarkers, these inflammatory markers, it were all very, very, very high in the range of MISC. COVID was positive. Even antibody also was positive actually in that child. So finally on the second day, actually,
Siba, your voice is breaking.
Initially, there was no respiratory symptom. We intubated our admission, normal pediatric ICU. But somehow the child had severe respiratory, hypoxia, and when we repeated the X-ray, it was clear-cut ARDS type of presentation. We had not done echo in the child. Yes, sir. And then I think, sir, I will discuss it some another time, sir.
No.
So actually, we lost the child. Finally, we lost the child.
Now you are audible. I think video you should stop.
No, we heard it. Ebor will actually answer that question, because ARDS shock, that's critical disease. And I think, we don't know all the answers. You can probably have a concurrent infection, but your child was also antibody positive is what
positive is saying.
So
both artificial positive and antibody positive.
Yeah, so I think if you are in a place which is endemic for malaria, I would not be surprised at all if you have multisystem inflammatory syndrome and a falciparum positivity. And I think, Ebor, ICU, you have seen children with more than one infection, but although it's
yeah. So we have seen in scrub typhus, Siba, but they have not gone into ARDS, but scrub typhus being positive. The same time, antibodies, CRP being very high as well. And I think we had one child with dengue, but in dengue usually we'll have a CRP is low. So here the CRP was high and the dengue serology also is positive. But they are not that sick enough for like a ARDS or shock, like what you have seen. So we are treated like with doxycycline, and they were given a low dose steroids as well for some time when the initial shock is resolved.
There are very few case reports actually association of malaria with falciparum malaria with COVID-19 leading to severity of illness.
Severity, right.
And I was just thinking whether it was, and because of the CT value was on the higher side, we were thinking the child may be on the second week or third week of acute COVID. Maybe at that time the antibody is rising, and it was a case of MISC with falciparum malaria. Association of falciparum malaria may have led to this severity of illness. That was what I was thinking. I don't know exactly.
No, because
Possible.
Yeah, possible. I mentioned even scrub typhus, severe scrub typhus, ARDS is possible. Falciparum malaria, ARDS is less likely. Cerebral malaria, you will, have seizures. But I think in this situation, especially with your high CT value, antibody positivity, ARDS, that's, more in favor of a MIS-C presentation. And, the question is, how did the falciparum, there is one way that falciparum can actually worsen your symptoms, because with a high parasitic load, you actually have sluggish circulation, and you can, in COVID, you have a prothrombotic state. So theoretically speaking, falciparum infection can worsen a prothrombotic state in COVID.
Yes, sir. Possible.
Okay. Any more questions?
Thank you for such a wonderful session, sir. Ever sir should take over now.
Thank you, Siva. And now it is a wonderful session. Great. I request Dr. Kala, our professor and head of PICU, to conclude.
Okay, so thank you, Ebor. I want to thank Winsley, Walson, and for this great session. I'm sure you would all agree that we had an excellent session. Siva Pratap for moderating the program. I think one thing that came out of COVID was this networking. Who would have thought 2 years ago, pre-COVID, that one day we will be networking on a common platform and sort of discussing. So I think it's really great, and I congratulate Ebor for organizing such a great session, and of course the audience for your patient listening. Over to you, Ebor.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Kala. So thanks you all, and